Greetings and welcome to another edition of Montpelier Connection. I'm State Representative Mike Mrowicki from the Windham 4 District of Putney, Dummerston, and Westminster. I'm here today with Representative Dick Marek of Newfane, and there's some other towns you represent besides Newfane?
Townsend and Marlborough.
There you go. Another.
And it's now Windham 5. We changed numbers with reapportionment. We all have to get used to new numbers.
Yeah. Well, thanks a lot for taking the time. We are here at the Statehouse today. Today's highlight of the day will be the governor's budget address. We're all looking forward to that because we are starting the year once again facing a budget gap, and by the end of the year we will close that gap, but how we do it is the details we need to find out starting today. And
important details they are.
Yep. There's a number of areas. Since I work in human services, there's a lot of concerns that there'll be some challenges to face there. But Human Services this year has been working a lot with judiciary, and as the governor said in his State of the State address, one of the biggest problems facing Vermont right now is addiction, specifically opiate addiction, and there seems to be a shift that is attracting some national attention as to we can't arrest our way out of this problem. And the governor has some good ideas, and we've been hearing about them. Last week we had a joint hearing where the idea of pretrial interventions came up. Can you share a little bit about what you heard there?
Sure, I'd be happy to. And just to preface that, as you know, Mike, we, in our two committees last year, spent a huge amount of time working on opiate-related issues, and we really passed an omnibus bill on that subject that addressed a number of the components of addiction, how to deal with addiction, and had much the same focus as the governor's address this year, which is why I think we were all really pleased to hear an address that focused on that issue. It is interesting to note that, and I think it's shocking to note, that the number of deaths from opiate overdoses in Vermont last year approached very closely the number of people who died on our highways, which is truly shocking. And the governor had a couple of focuses in his address. One was early intervention, to shift from dealing with people simply through the court system to trying to deal with them at the very inception of a criminal charge being contemplated. And I think his comments were very well taken that frequently with addiction there's sort of a, call it a golden moment, if you will, when the individual is most likely to be willing to focus on dealing with the addiction. The problem with the criminal justice system is that in honoring people's right to due process and looking at court calendars that are overly clogged, when someone's charged, by the time they actually get in front of the judge in a meaningful way, for a plea bargain or for a trial, the moment when they are most likely to be willing to really focus on need for help is past. And there's a corollary to that, that we have long known that we have very significant waiting lists of people who want to get into drug treatment programs. And we simply don't have space for them in the treatment programs we have, and we don't have treatment programs throughout the state. So the governor, as you said, is, I think, focusing on getting a hold of the demand side of the equation. It doesn't mean that we're abandoning the criminal justice approach for people who are significant dealers. We need to take those people out of the picture as much as we can.
And one of the things I believe the governor said in his address as well is that we're going to start, or he wants to increase the penalties for people who come from out of state selling drugs. I believe he also talked about people who use a firearm in the commission of a crime. I think
any weapon. Yeah, and that's an area that I think my committee in particular will be looking at. And I frankly don't know the answer to that. Conceptually, I'm in favor of very significant penalties for significant dealers. The question I have right from the get-go, and we have not taken testimony in this yet in my committee this year, is to take a look at the existing penalty structure and also to try to get a sense of what the existing sentencing is under the existing structure. For example, if we have we a few years ago spent considerable time trying to rationalize our sentencing structure for different drug crimes because they were all over the ballpark. You could have a much longer sentence for one drug than you had for another drug that was of equivalent dangerousness. And we tried to look at that and come up with a framework that we then adopted that said if you are convicted of a roughly equivalent crime, you ought to have a roughly equivalent sentencing structure. And I think it's important to look at what we have in place right now and see, do we have gaps that need to be strengthened? If we do, we certainly should. But if we, for example, have a maximum 15-year sentence for bringing a certain amount of drug into the state and the sentences are only in the 5-year range, then we can make it a 20-year maximum sentence, but we haven't really accomplished anything.
Right.
So I think those are things that we really are going to bore into. The notion, however, that people who are significant drug dealers and are bringing drugs into the state, because our supply does come from Springfield, New York, Boston, we need to really make sure those people understand that Vermont is not an easy place to do business.
You bet. Now this is the time of year where most of our time is spent in committee doing that kind of research, or also positioning which bills, in fact, we will take up. Are there other bills in the Judiciary Committee that you've taken a look at just to start with and maybe work on more down the road?
We're just getting started. Of course, this is the beginning of the second week of the biennium, and last week we had the State of the State address, which occupied a fair amount of attention, and this week we have the budget address coming up this afternoon. But yeah, we in addition to the opiate testimony, we have started work on looking at revising the current guardianship laws in the state of Vermont, which I was somewhat surprised to find out were last revised in the 1920s.
Oh, no kidding.
And much of the world has changed since the 1920s, and so we're just starting to take testimony on that to find better paths for dealing with issues of dysfunctional families and ways to have guardianships that have some finite end period. Right now, guardianships, if a guardianship for a child in a bad family situation is approved, they are essentially open-ended. And we think it makes sense to have the parties at the beginning of that process have an understanding of what they perceive as a logical termination point, or at least a point to review a guardianship. So that's something we're just beginning. We're also looking at something that will be of real interest to the environmental community, and that is conservation easements, which we have many of in Vermont, both through local conservation groups and through statewide groups like the Nature Conservancy and the Vermont Land Trust. And currently under the law, it's very, very difficult if the original rationale for the easement needs to be changed, sometimes in a very minor way, to permit a road shoulder to be widened a couple of feet, but sometimes in a significant way. It may, to use an extreme example, it might have been a great idea in 1890 to conserve your pig farm in downtown Burlington, or in the edge of downtown Burlington, but it's now become a totally urban area, and although there ought to be a conservation use made of the dedicated resource, it may make more sense to sell that land and buy a much larger endangered parcel somewhere else in the state. Currently there's no mechanism to allow that to be done, and it potentially endangers any IRS deduction. So we're looking at that, and the bill that we have in front of us, I think, has very, very strong constraints on the ability to do that, so that you can't simply ignore what the original intent was, but you can also make reasonable adjustments, because these things are perpetual. And as someone testified in our committee, what might have made sense in 1790 may not make sense in 2014, or may require some change. So we're looking at that one as well.
Well, there's a number of areas where we're looking at bringing our laws into the 21st century. A couple that we passed already, which was built on work that started last year, was a bill which would, and I'm forgetting the terminology though, but I think it was heightened consideration, where there are instances of individuals going before the Public Service Board there have been concerns that individuals who don't have a lot of money for lawyers or small groups are at a disadvantage to larger corporations when they go before the Public Service Board. And I think we did something last week. We passed a vote which came out of the Commerce Committee, which would create another level called heightened consideration. Did your committee take a look at that bill at all?
We actually didn't see that bill, but I think the notion is certainly well taken. Individuals can have legitimate issues on a variety of areas where they really don't have the expertise to walk in against potentially a very well-funded and well-lawyered group. And so creating a standard that gives those individuals a little bit more of a consideration, and you know, we have public advocacy entities, and the Public Service Board is designed to protect the public interest, but sometimes that interest is a narrower one, or the board simply doesn't have the resources to delve into things. So giving those people the ability to at least say to the Public Service Board, you know, we need a little extra consideration for our perspective is useful, I think.
I think specifically there have been concerns about where wind towers have been cited, or even cell towers, and we both know in our towns how easy that is.
Highly controversial.
It is. And the point was made that I think there should be a little bit more consideration given for individuals who don't have the ability to hire a New York or Boston lawyer to come in and argue their case.
Yeah, I mean, the cell tower siting is a good example. When we passed the law in that area, we had, and I think the public had a very definite interest in seeing broadband and cell service expanded to the whole state as quickly as possible. We both know the lack of that in our district has been a major issue.
One of the most common calls I get.
That's right.
But we don't want a cell tower.
But we don't want a cell tower in that location, exactly. And I was involved in some discussion in my village where there was an attempt to have a tower right on the Newfane Common.
Was this the Sheriff's Department?
This was, well, the Sheriff's Department wanted to be able to use it for retransmission, and that was an important interest and one that we needed to give effect to. The problem was the location picked was in the middle of a National Historic District, which is not a permissible location, and there's also a deed restriction on the Newfane Common preventing any commercial use of it. So it wouldn't have ever passed through the Public Service Board approval process. The federal review person indicated that no, they wouldn't approve that. And secondly, if it were approved, it would have caused potentially them to lose title to the common, which seemed excessive. But there were 3 or 4 other locations within sight of the common that made much more sense. Higher locations, largely wooded. But when we passed that, we had the goal of expediting the review process to make sure these things got built and didn't all get bogged down. I'm not sure we got the balance quite right, though, because we did not give enough weight to local input. I know my select board was immensely frustrated with another location that was suggested that they didn't feel they had any opportunity in a meaningful way to comment on. And frankly, the company that was looking at the Newfane Common Tower was very cooperative and worked with us. The other company in a different location in the town tended to take the attitude that we know where we're going to put it and we have to ask you, but we're not going to pay much attention. And so that balance is one that we're always trying to strike and to adjust. And frankly, frequently when we pass bills, 2 years, 4 years later, we say it needs some adjustment, it needs some tweaking. We don't get things perfect necessarily on the first attempt, and keeps us in business.
Well, I think it's one of the strengths of the process, though, that we can go back and revisit and amend as circumstances and times change.
Someone who never changes their mind isn't thinking.
Well, there's an old saying that somebody who sets their ideas in stone winds up with rocks in their head. Another bill we passed is something we started last year, went to a committee of conference because there were differences between the Senate and the House, and its campaign finance reform. Now, there's been some confusion. There's been some information put out there, some information that's not really accurate. And I think a lot of us wanted campaign reform to move forward, and I think that's why we moved this bill. It starts with the Supreme Court decision, Citizens United versus the U.S. Now, my understanding is that court decision rendered null and void any campaign finance reform, any campaign finance laws we had. Is that inaccurate?
Well, I think it is, and I think actually the decision prior to that on the Vermont law itself negated our law, and there's a doctrine that essentially says that when you pass a law, you have repealed the prior law. If the law you pass, the new law, is overturned by the court, it doesn't revive necessarily the old law. So there has been a significant question in Vermont as to whether we have any campaign finance law whatsoever. That being said, the Citizens United case has put basically handcuffs on any meaningful campaign finance reform. And frankly, the only way we're going to ever get meaningful campaign finance laws in this country is to have a different U.S. Supreme Court reconsider the issue and go back to what had been largely settled doctrine in terms of the fact that, yes, you can constrain spending in a reasonable way. What we passed was I think in all of our views, probably a highly unsatisfactory bill. I think people need to understand, first of all, that the way it came to us this year was out of a House-Senate conference committee, which was started at the end of last session but couldn't complete its work. And when something comes out of a conference committee between the House and Senate to resolve differences between the two bills that each body has passed, those can't be amended on the floor. You have a straight up or down vote. Here's the conference committee report, yay or nay. So most of us, I think, cast a groaning vote. It was 124 to 15 vote, but I don't think there were many people in the chamber who were happy with what we passed. But it was a question of, is this better than nothing? And it did create greater transparency for PACs, and it increased some spending contribution limits, which I think many of us didn't think was a great idea. Frankly, it reduced the spending limits for House and Senate campaigns, for State House and Senate. So in a sense, we were voting to limit our own ability to have contributions more than some other spots. So was it a good bill? It was better than nothing, and I think that's about the best you can say about it. But I think the people who opposed it and the entities, the lobbyists who opposed it, basically were hoping that we could pass a much stronger bill, and I think that just simply wasn't doable given the legal constraints we're operating under.
I think for many of us, myself included, we want campaign finance reform, and this is a start. As we mentioned just earlier, part of the process here is to come back in a couple of years and look at the results of what we've done, and if we need to change it and amend it. That's part of how the process is malleable that way, and it will be an ongoing process. The important thing here was to get a start. Right,
and the irony in Vermont is that the regular campaigns tend not to be horribly expensive, certainly by national standards.
I know. I raised $99 in my last campaign.
My last contested campaign, I spent $300, and would have liked to have not spent that. But $300 for a House campaign in the rest of the country would be absolutely laughable. You'd be a total outlier. You wouldn't even be a valid candidate. The real spending in Vermont, ironically, in the last campaign was one individual in Burlington who essentially formed a PAC.
$1 million.
Put a nice name on it, spent $1 million of her money, and had two other people who contributed. I believe it was $1,000 apiece, and gave it a wonderful glowing name that made you think this was a large group of Vermonters who shared her views. There's another individual who has a group that is supposedly nonpartisan right now. He has spent over $1 million advancing his views, some of which are good, and many of which, though, tend to reflect the views of one of the two political parties in Bear Stearns.
Yes.
And it's always nice when an executive from a failed Wall Street firm comes in and tells us about transparency and ethics. And transparency and ethics are something we are going to pass this year, I believe.
But not the Bear Stearns version.
Not the Bear Stearns version. We've tended not to have a lot of laws in that area. We haven't had a lot of problems in that area, but it certainly is perfectly worthwhile to have a good statutory structure, and I'm confident that we'll pass one this year.
And I agree, and I think that the irony is that here's an individual from Wall Street at a firm that had a big hand in the economic morass that we're still trying to dig our way in, trying to come to Vermont and tell us how to do our business here.
It's ironic, but it doesn't mean that there aren't good ideas that can come from that source.
Right.
But the danger in Vermont, though, that I'm trying to highlight is that you have two individuals of very, very substantial means who have the ability to shape candidate discussion and political discussion in the state in a way that no other Vermonter has. And it would be nice if the Supreme Court would give more attention to the need to balance that playing field so that all of us have a meaningful voice. The person who has the loudspeaker can shout louder than the person who has to whisper. Most of us have to whisper.
I think Vermonters expect that. We have the town meeting tradition. We have the tradition of people being able to get in touch with their legislators at every level and have a conversation with them. We don't want that to stop.
No, and the good thing in Vermont is actually there's been a fairly robust history in recent years of the candidates who have vastly outspent their opponents not winning. Because we still have retail politics in this state. You campaign, and I've always advised this to candidates, you campaign for a legislative seat by wearing out shoes, not by spending a lot of money.
And goodwill out.
That's right.
Well, I appreciate you taking the time on a busy schedule.
It's been fun.
And I hope we can do this again before the session ends.
I hope so. We'll probably have a lot more progress to report, and when we get done with today, we'll know what the budget recommendations are, which will really be part of the conversation.
It all comes back to the budget, doesn't it?
It's true.
Well, that's it for today. Until next time, this is State Representative Mike Mrowicki. And thanks to you for watching, and thanks to all the good people back at BCTV for helping make this happen.
Thank you.
Bye-bye now.